Good evening, and I welcome everyone to the opening session of the ACC 2022 Early Career Leadership Council series on transitions for the early career cardiologist. I'm Sana Christopher. I'm a member of the ACC Early Career Leadership Council. I'm an interventional cardiologist with Hawaii Pacific Health in Honolulu, Hawaii, and I'm also assistant professor of medicine with the University of Hawaii John A. Burns School of Medicine. The aim of today's session is to address various aspects of the research experience that are crucial for early careers and also fellows in training that are transitioning to different practice models. We're hoping to have the opportunity to learn from and interact with leaders in the field who are paving the way for cardiovascular research. The session is also fairly unique in that following the discussion, the participants do have the ability to directly interact with our panel following our talk. I would like to begin by introducing my co-moderator, Dr. Poonam Valagapudi. She's chair of the ACC Early Career Leadership Council. She's a structural interventional cardiologist and an assistant professor of medicine at the University of Nebraska. She's also the associate program director of the fellowship program and director of social media strategy for the cardiology program. Welcome, Dr. Valagapudi. All right, now I would like to introduce our guest speaker for today. It is an absolute honor for us to host Dr. Gregg Stone. Dr. Stone is the Director of Academic Affairs for the Mount Sinai Heart Health System. He's the Professor of Medicine, Cardiology, and Population Health and Policy at the Zena and Michael E. Weiner's Cardiovascular Institute and the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, New York. He is a leader in the field of interventional cardiology research and one of the most highly cited researchers worldwide. He has been principal investigator for hundreds of national and international multi-center randomized trials and has authored nearly 3,000 book chapters, manuscripts, and abstracts published in peer-reviewed literature. He's also mentored many current and future leaders and researchers, and it is an absolute pleasure to have you with us and learn from your experience today, Dr. Stone. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Sana. It's really a pleasure to be here on behalf of the American College of Cardiology and working with young people as we describe the next generation of interventionalists and cardiologists. I think it's one of the highest honors that anyone can have. So let me give you maybe about a 10-minute preamble about why it's so important to, consider a career beyond just clinical practice. And when we look at, the three pillars of what it means to be a physician, we think of taking care of patients. That's the essence and the heart and soul of who we are. But then it goes, I think, beyond that, because when you take care of patients, you can help one person at a time. But we also have a higher responsibility, I believe, and that is to try to advance medical knowledge to help the entire subspecialty. And of course, we do that through, medical research, particularly clinical research if you're a clinician, and then education. And so the three pillars of patient care, research, and education really, I think, provide a well-rounded life. And I think that's important because most of you are going to have, long careers, 40 years or more when you think about it. Some of you may retire in your early 50s, but for many of you, you'll practice into your 60s, 70s, and many will never retire. And so it's important to realize that the sum of medical knowledge, probably 50% turns over about every 10 years. And that's extraordinary. I mean, when I was back in high school, which to me does not seem like very long ago, that's when deoxyribonucleic acid was discovered. I mean, think of how fundamental that is. When I think back and into my fellowship and think of the drugs that we used back then that we're still using now, well, there's normal saline, potassium, and Lasix, and probably not too many others. So the knowledge base that we have, and there were no terms. Of course, when I was in my fellowship, there was no coronary angioplasty. Surgery was just starting to come into its own. We were transitioning our thinking of what caused an acute myocardial infarction from an imbalance of oxygen demand to the supply equation. The level of knowledge that we have now is transformational compared to 30 or 40 years ago. And I've been doing this out of my training for about 35 years now. So number one, you need it for your own education. You need it to be able to keep up yourself. And there's no better way to keep up. Yes, you can do it by going to conferences, you can do it by reading articles and talking to your colleagues, but there's really no better way to stay up with the field and to achieve becoming a master clinician and staying a master clinician than being involved in clinical research and actually generating the evidence yourself. And it keeps things incredibly fresh. I mean, I trained as an interventional cardiologist, and probably the first 20 years of my career or so was really strict coronary intervention. But then, of course, as the field continued to expand beyond interventional cardiology to first peripheral vascular intervention and then structural intervention, my interests expanded as well. And, of course, you can't live on an island. Interventional cardiology, if that's all you're considering, involves so much more than just being a plumber. You have to become an expert hematologist, pharmacologist, endocrinologist, nephrologist. So, I mean, every system is obviously related. So now, I've evolved from leading trials initially just in a coronary intervention to now systemic hypertension and heart failure and pulmonary hypertension and other areas that, 25 years ago, I would say I have no right putting myself out as an expert as, and I'm still probably not an expert, but I've learned an awful lot about those areas. And it's become an absolutely fascinating journey. So for me, it's an extraordinary opportunity to keep things fresh, to continue to expand your knowledge base, and continue to improve not only as a researcher and educator, but as a clinician, because of how well-rounded you become by just being involved in clinical research and the necessity that entails to really become an expert to some degree in multiple different areas. So then the question really is, okay, so how do you transition from being a resident and a fellow to becoming a clinical researcher? The reality is that if you want to become an independent clinical researcher, unfortunately, it does require funding. Again, the reality of the world is that nothing we really do in clinical research can be done in a vacuum without considering how research is going to get funded. And in that regard, of course, there's two major sources. There's governmental funding, whether it's from NIH or PCORI or other institutions. And of course, there's a whole deep grant process where you evolve from K grants to R01 grants, ultimately U grants, et cetera. I won't talk too much about that tonight, but that's a very valid way to go. And there's tremendous advantages in governmental funding because you can really answer many of the strategies there's no other funding sources for. And there are fewer conflicts, not no conflicts, but fewer conflicts on the governmental funding side. But probably the majority of clinical research in this country, at least, gets funded by industry-sponsored research. And in there, it's very important to realize both the overlapping goals, but also the tensions that can develop in receiving funding from industry-sponsored research. You as a academician are going to want to try to improve outcomes for patients, and you want your search to be directed towards doing that. Now, we partner very well with our colleagues in industry, and we call them colleagues because they're drugs and the tools and come up with, in many cases, the techniques that allow us to take better care of our patients. So while there are a lot of people that want to create a competitive and hands-off environment between physicians and industry, that's really wrong, and that's really counterproductive to being able to move the field forward. Now, it is certainly true that industry does have a major priority to serve their stock price and to be able to produce profits. That's, American capitalism. And so you have to realize that. But I think the companies that really are successful are the ones that realize that if they put patients first, and if they come out with products that are going to improve patient outcomes, and we're very, very rigorous, we're very evidence-based right now with what we do, that secondarily, everybody's going to win. That they will create devices that improve patient outcomes. We will be able to demonstrate relatively independently from industry that those products improve patient results. We'll be able to publish that. We'll be able to, again, meet our academic goals. And then secondarily, industry will appropriately benefit from being able to sell those drugs and devices. But it used to be that the system could be gamed, but no longer. And I would say cardiology, and arguably even interventional cardiology in particular, is probably the most evidence-based subspecialty in all of medicine. Almost nothing is done without us these days answering a major question with multiple randomized trials, or at least wanting to answer those questions with randomized trials. And when you look at the guidelines and when you talk about your level of evidence A, B, and C, it used to be that about 70% or so was level of evidence C, just expert opinion, and that's actually decreasing. For the endpoints that really matter, we're generating more and more evidence every single day, and there is a lot of funding to be achieved, to be able to realize in cardiology, because the funding sources, whether it's government or industry, realize that that's what moves the needle. That we're all evidence-based, and we all need the answer to those questions addressed in a rigorous fashion for us to be able to apply those therapies. Otherwise, it's primum non nocere. We're not going to do any harm, and in general, we're not going to apply therapies unless we have evidence for both safety and effectiveness, and then ultimately as well. So again, critically important to transition into clinical research. A few of you may want to do basic research, by the way, while you have a clinical practice. Not impossible, but very, very difficult to do. I mean, running a basic science laboratory really, really is a full-time job. But clinical research, you can have a certain amount of your careers dedicated to clinical research, while a certain proportion is also dedicated to taking care of patients. And that mix is going to vary from person to person. It might be 90% clinical practice and 10% clinical research for some people. And then on the other hand, it might be 10%, 90% clinical research for others. Why don't I list 100% for either of those possibilities? Well, actually, the essence, I believe, of being a clinical researcher is taking care of patients, because it's through taking care of patients that you see where the unmet clinical needs are. You see the clinical syndromes, you see the questions that need to be answered, you realize where the issues are. And unless you really know how to take care of patients and become really good at it, I think that you will not be as good at clinical research as you could ultimately be. Yes, you can do clinical research, but if you want to ask the questions, the important questions, and then understand how to address them within clinical studies, to be able to change practice and answer those questions, the essence of that starts with being a practitioner. So I really don't recommend that anybody, certainly not at the beginning or the middle portion of the career, spends all their time on clinical research and education. Again, at least in cardiology, you really need to be grounded in being a practitioner. But then once you've made that decision to want to do clinical research, again, there are many ways to do it. You can do it purely in a private practice setting by just being one of many sites, multiple sites, for example, in a large-scale investigation. And then if you contribute a lot of patients as one of those sites, that's extraordinarily valuable, especially in the United States. And this could be a whole hour in itself, but enrolling patients in clinical research has become more and more difficult as physicians are bogged down with paperwork and RVU priorities that often detract from clinical research, a problem that's not as evident, for example, in the European Union. So if you make a commitment in your practice to identify patients that are appropriate for clinical studies and ensure that they get entered either through your own work or by working with your research coordinators, that will be seen as very, very valuable. And most large-scale multi-center studies reward substantial clinical trial enrollment by not only putting your name on a major manuscript, but then allowing you to access the database, answer important secondary questions. And that's, for example, one of the ways my career got. And then when you do that, and when you start to publish some of those articles that are interesting and intriguing, Sometimes they ask more questions that they answer, but they're very thought-provoking and they show your intelligence and your drive. That ultimately people will start coming to you to first put you on steering committees, et cetera. Industry will start wanting to work with you. NIH will recognize you and recognize your name when you submit. And ultimately, you'll develop the sophistication and the insights to be able to start asking some of those questions on your own. And that's ultimately where many of you will want to get at. You won't just want to be part of a big clinical trial enterprise, but you would like to lead it. And I get that. Recognizing that most of this cannot be done on your own, and it really does take a huge number of people to run a successful a randomized clinical trial. A large-scale trial, you're talking hundreds of people and then thousands of doctors. If you look at all of the sites, doctors, research coordinators, allied healthcare assessors, and personnel. So you've got to learn how to work in a team. You've got to learn how to work collaboratively. You've got to learn to work with other subspecialties. For example, I work with cardiac imagers, cardiac surgeons, multiple other subspecialists, whether they're nephrologists, heart failure specialists, endocrinologists, et cetera, very intimately. We often bring them onto steering committees. We're calling them all the time. And you've got to be humble, don't know, and to allow their expertise to contribute to the clinical studies that you're involved in. So ultimately, again, there's many ways to get involved. That's one way. Another way to get involved, which is a way that's obviously relevant at large medical centers, is to find one or more mentors and to work with those mentors on projects that he or she has started. And again, you can work with them on clinical trials operations for ongoing studies. You can work with them on analyzing data. You can work with them on writing up sub-studies. You can work with them on brainstorming ideas. But you identify one or more mentors, because it's actually a good idea not to put all your eggs in one basket. Work with a couple different people in a couple different areas. For those of you that are at centers that are doing a lot of clinical research, such as Mount Sinai, many of the New York hospitals, the Harvard hospitals, the TIMI study group, Duke, et cetera, et cetera. We're blessed in this country with a lot of leading medical centers. There are many, many people that are at those centers because they want to work with young people. And they realize that's part of their mission. And it's, yes, while it sometimes can be taxing to, teach what I might consider to be very, very basic, it's also, part of what drives us to be in this environment and to work with some of the fellows, that I've been working with 3 or 4 years now, and to look at their knowledge base and where they are now compared to they were 3 to 4 years ago is really remarkable and is very, very satisfying, rewarding for me. So that's kind of an introduction on the importance of clinical research, considering government versus industry funding, looking to get involved in multi-center projects and or identifying mentors and working with them very, very closely, and not wanting to rush it. There's a lot of people that do want to do clinical research. It's not reasonable to think that, a year out of your fellowship, you're going to be running a $100 million clinical trial. But that's the kind of thing that can come in 8 or 10 years. And 8 or 10 years may only be a quarter of the way into your career. And so while it sounds like a long time, it's actually just, an ongoing commitment that you have to make. So with that in mind, hopefully that's some food for thought, and I'd love to get involved, and we'll answer more questions tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Stone. That was phenomenal, and I think this was exactly the sort of high-yield advice that we were hoping to get from all your experience in research. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our early career faculty panel as well for a roundtable discussion now. I would like to introduce Dr. Fatma Rodriguez. She is an assistant professor of cardiovascular medicine at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Her research focus areas are cardiovascular disease prevention, health equity, and digital health. She has been the recipient of multiple awards for her excellence in the field of research, and most recently, in 2022, Dr. Rodriguez was awarded the ACC Douglas P. Zipes Distinguished Young Scientist Award for impressive contributions to cardiovascular research, specifically addressing racial, ethnic, and gender disparities. Welcome, Dr. Rodriguez.
Thank you.
Right. I would also like to introduce Dr. Aditya Bhardwaj. He is also a member of the ACC Early Career Leadership Council and the chair of the the Early Career Chair of the ACC California chapter. He's an interventional cardiologist and assistant professor of medicine, director of complex coronary interventions, chair of the cardiovascular research and outreach program, and associate program director for interventional cardiology at the Loma Linda University Healthcare System. He's also a top enroller in trials such as Restore Heart Failure, the National Cardiogenic Shock Initiative, and the ongoing Protect 4 trial. Welcome, Dr. Bhardwaj.
Thank you.
Great. So I would like to open with a question for Dr. Rodriguez. One of the things that a lot of early careers feel challenging at the stage in their careers is actually obtaining funding and grants. What has been your experience, and what are strategies that have worked well for you?
Thank you for that question. I'll just echo a lot of what Dr. Stone says. I mean, you have to diversify your funding mechanisms. And our chair of medicine is Bob Harrington, who I know Dr. Stone knows well. And he always says the only bad money is no money. So it depends on your question. That's the kind of the funding source that you should try. And you have to write frequently to get that. I will say it's useful to start early. So I'll say for me, I started doing postdoctoral awards. So things like F32s, ACC Merck Fellowships, American Heart Association postdoc grants, because even though those are very small in terms of amount of money, just getting in the practice of writing grants, of expressing your questions and ideas is very helpful as you try to look for larger grants like career development awards and industry grants later on. So I would say number one is find a good mentor. Keep applying, and you have to kind of have a thick skin, because sometimes you think something's a great idea and the reviewers may not agree, and that's really on you to make sure your idea is clear and that it's feasible with the team and the resources you've proposed.
That's a great point that you make, especially when you're doing governmental grants, and you'll have 5 or 6 reviewers on every grant, and the larger the grant, the smaller the proportion of patients awarded. So you may be at 5%, 8% grants get awarded. And so the grant reviewers are supposed to be very harsh and supposed to be critical. And it's almost impossible to get 5 or 6 really good reviews. And so when you read these, you've got to have a thick skin, as you mentioned. You've got to look through, and sometimes the reviewers don't understand your proposal. And sometimes it's really on them. And you've got to be able to discount that and not get too frustrated. But you also have to be able to constructively look at the comments that they make. I was actually reviewing a grant that a colleague had gotten today, and one of the major comments that 2 of 6 reviewers had made is that their project didn't have any source of external validity, no way to generalize the results, to prove generalizability within the grant. And they wanted to, if we're going to give you all this money, we want to see models you create and what you show works not only inside your data set, but works outside as well. And those are very good comments. And so this person is now, going to rewrite the grant and revise it, working in, and that's going to take some work to be able to do that for that amount of major revision. So it's really important to look to see the points that you can take constructively, just like with a manuscript review, where you should revise, and the ones that you should either push back on or respectfully, or else just ignore.
Those are great points. Maybe Aditya, you can touch upon a little bit for our early career colleagues how to start as a site PI. What are the nuts and bolts, and how you built up that aspect of your career?
Sure. Thanks, Poonam. So, before I actually get into that, I want to put another pitch as to why it's important and what are the benefits of being involved in industry-sponsored research. It's something that Dr. Gregg Stone very eloquently stated. But just to add a couple of things to what he already said. I mean, I think there are three most important reasons, the way I look at it, as to why, as early careers, industry-sponsored research is a low-hanging fruit and a great place to start off. Number one, I mean, you get to be at the forefront of changing the course of medicine. I mean, we all know that randomized controlled trials are by far regarded as the gold standard for evaluating any therapy. And there's FDA data that shows that 70% of our studies in the US are actually industry sponsored. So, like you can imagine, most of the practice changing research is happening because of industry sponsored research. Secondly, I look at it as a mutually beneficial, a symbiotic relationship, if you will. The academic center and the investigator provides the patient population, the clinical infrastructure, and clinical expertise. And the industry sponsor, from their side, provides funding, they provide the research infrastructure, and they provide the opportunity for the clinician and the center to be at the forefront of this cutting edge technology. And most importantly, I think as early career cardiologists, when you start off, being involved in a large industry sponsored trial gives you a close look to how leaders in the field would function. I mean, if you think of it, all the steering committees consist of people who've been doing this for a long time, who really understand the nuts and bolts of what a randomized controlled trial is going to be like. So just by interacting with them, with them, being on the PI calls, you get an insight into what a well thought out research methodology looks like, and you learn a lot in the process. So having said that, coming to your question, Poonam, in terms of some of the challenges, I mean, I think all whatever type of research we want to get involved in, especially when you start out, has its challenges, and industry-sponsored research, clinical research, is really no different. I mean, at most places, you don't quite walk into an infrastructure that already exists. In most places, it's always work in progress, and especially as a new early career attending, when you graduate from fellowship and when you're starting off your career, there are a number of things that you encounter, including some of the things that we talked about. Picking the right kind of trials. You want to pick the trials that you know you're going to succeed in. You want to make sure that your center and your colleagues have the kind of patients that the trial is looking for, making sure that there's no very strict inclusion exclusion criteria. You want to get onto a trial at the right time, mostly at the beginning of the trial. You don't want to get onto a trial after they've enrolled 70% of the patients, for example. You want to make sure that you have the right kind of support. And I think we talked about research coordinators, and I think research coordinators are key in setting you up for success in these randomized controlled trials. Now, having said that, I think research coordinators play a large role. They make sure you're compliant with the IRB stuff. They help you off with the startup process, etc. But having said that, I think the person who's still steering the ship is the principal investigator. I look at it as the way attendings work with residents and fellows. I mean, yes, residents and fellows are there to help you, but the buck still stops with that attending position. So, and the third most important thing is the finance, and I think this is something that we've gone through with our own institution. I think Dr. Rodriguez talked about the other side of it. I mean, the industry-sponsored research is often looked at as a very lucrative undertaking, but it's not always so. I mean, you have to think about everything. I mean, you have research coordinators to pay, so you want to pick the trials that bring the money. You want to do a good job at enrolling patients. If you really want to turn this into a venture that, if not will make money, at least break even.
I'll just add that's a really good point, because you can lose money with industry's trials if you don't have the infrastructure. And the way, for me, I focus on prevention and preventive cardiology. I was a site PI for the ischemia trial at Stanford, and I lost money. That was my first, experience as a PI. But the protection was so important. So I'm getting a lot of background. Was so important that I thought it was worth doing, and it was okay. But you have to have a balance of those kind of negative and positive trials. But all those are important points to consider. I think we're under the perception that industry trials make money. but that's not necessarily true. Again, depends on the mechanisms. If you have a place, and it sounds like Dr. Bardor has that it's a site that your system is adept to enrolling patients, high volume. Where I am at Stanford, it's not so the case. We're working on it because everything is more expensive here. So every test is more expensive here. So this is sometimes how to think creatively about decentralizing protocols, and that's more at the higher level phase. But you want to do that. Most sites or hospitals or health systems will have some sort of body that you can run things by at the proposal stage and say, does this make sense? So you want to do that at the beginning, not in the middle of the study.
Those are great points. Dr.
Yeah,
Stone, I'd like to hear from you what pushes you, what keeps you going and motivated. You have so many amazing trials. The CARP trial is a life-changing trial. You've done so many others. What keeps you motivated and keeps you going?
Oh gosh, it's a lot of different things. It's one, it comes out of the essence of the patient, why I went into medicine in the first place, and that was to help patients. And early in my career, I was more 90% clinically oriented and only 10% research and education. And then once I had done 4,000, then 6,000, then 8,000 procedures, and had my outpatient clinics for and seen 10,000 patients in an outpatient clinic. I started to gradually and progressively ask, well, how can I do more, and how can I help beyond the individuals that I was seeing to the general medical community. And while all that, I've always been fascinated by the unknowns, as much as the knowns. And I kept seeing things, and I kept saying, we're doing things, we don't know why we're doing these things, and we don't know that there's not better ways to do them. One of the first, projects early on I was really involved in was in primary angioplasty and acute myocardial infarction. And Bill O'Neill, Sidney Grimes, and I were, in the United States, kind of the trio that, really helped push forward primary PCI, through clinical studies. And we had our mentors, such as Jeff Hartzler, who did the first primary PCI, who knew it was better. He just knew it in his bones that it was better. But when we started, 99%, 99.5% of infarcts were being reperfused with first streptokinase and then TPA. And the intensity, the ferocity against PCI back then, was, you think, surgery PCI creates controversy now. The intensity back then with what we call the thrombolytic wars were incredible. And we knew that unless we did randomized trials, we weren't going to be able to change the world. And so then, for those of you from that are history buffs that might remember the first PAMI trial, that was a world-changing trial that led to people, in fact, didn't even believe it, how good the results were. It led to randomized trials, and they all showed the same thing. So once you have a success like that, and once you see how you can impact, how your impact can spread beyond your local environment to states, to your country, to other countries. And the international collaboration, I don't want to downplay either, because it's also an extraordinarily rewarding part of what I do. Then it just builds on itself. And then you keep getting more and more fascinated, and you keep, I always joke that I knew the most medicine the day I left my cardiology fellowship. That's when I knew the most. I thought I knew everything. Okay. And every single day through the present that I'm in this, quote, business, I realize I know less and less and less. How much more there is that we don't know compared to what we do know. And that just makes me, that just drives me. It's not gonna matter whether I'm 50, 60, 70, or 80. It just keeps driving me to want to answer those questions, to want to continue to change the knowledge base, to improve outcomes for our patients. So it's really the unknown that drives me. And again, seeing how, if nobody listens to what you're doing, it'd be much less rewarding. It could be self-satisfying, but much less rewarding. But seeing that when you do contribute to making discoveries, how everybody does want to listen. They may insist on replicating what you show, and that's good. But, the fact that it does change practice is incredibly rewarding, and just a great way to spend a life.
All right, fantastic. Well, Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Stone, Dr. Rodriguez, and Dr. Bardwaj. It's been a great talk for our early career and fellow and training attendees. We're going to break for the networking session at this time, so we'll have you seated on tables, and then our coordinators, Kate Bell and Kirsten West, will help with our participants to switch over.
Great, thank you.
Sounds great.
Thanks, everybody. So we